My name is Fred Siegel. I'm the moderator for tonight's panel. I want to welcome you, first of all, to St. Francis College, small college of big dreams. And for those of you who don't know St. Francis, it's a very friendly, very nice place. I am the scholar in residence here, and I can say I've never been in a nicer place. People are warm and friendly, and students are just nice, and they try. They're serious kids. Tonight's panel is obviously on an important subject for what's coming. For those of you who don't know, at noon today, Christie announced that he's not running. Just for those of you who didn't hear this, man. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a brief introduction. I'm going to introduce the members of the panel, and then I'll lay out the format for you. The gentleman to my left and right, Morley, Winogard, Mike Hayes, had the big book of 2008. It was called Millennial Makeover: MySpace, YouTube, and the Future of American Politics. It helped define how people thought about 2008 while it was happening and after it was over. Mike and Morley explained that the largest generation in American history, those born between 1982 and 2003, would shape 2008. They said this before it happened. They anticipated the future. And they were proven right from the outset. In the Iowa caucuses, the first contest in the nominating season, it was Obama's ability to draw in young voters that won him the Iowa caucuses, created a lead that he never relinquished. He made Hillary pay for having overlooked the importance of the youth vote. Under 30 voters went 6-1 for Obama over Clinton. It's an extraordinary margin. In the general election, the youth vote cast by those under 30 grew only to 17% from 16% in 2004. But it's the percentages. In 2004, Kerry won 54% of the youth vote, those under 30. Obama won the youth vote 62-32. Don't ask me where the other 6% went. Now, in this next election, the millennial generation could grow to as much as a quarter of the electorate. Then the question is, how is the millennial generation going to react to this current economic climate? We're in the midst of the most undemocratic small d recovery in American history. We've never seen an economic recovery. And leave aside whether this is a normal recession or a financial collapse. I think it's the latter, which means recovery will take longer. Even choosing either one of those, it is still the first recovery where much of the middle class has been left out of the recovery. Those who graduated from high school and college this year will be competing from graduates in 2008, 2009, 2010, who still haven't gotten jobs. And people say, well, yes, but college graduates have a much lower unemployment rate. They do. But they also have a very high underemployment rate. By that I mean, yes, they're employed, but many of them are not employed at what they were trained for. Many of them you might describe as underemployed. How will that affect them in 2012? Hopefully Morley and Mike will tell us. Another problem the millennial generation has is that people in my generation are not retiring. They planned on retiring in many cases, but they can't afford it. So they're still working, still clogging up employment ranks. In their new book, the authors of the Millennial Moment, Mike and Morley, follow up on their book about the Millennial Makeover. And I think they're going to provide a guide to how to think about how a quarter of the electorate is going to be thinking about the 2012 elections. Now let me describe what we're going to do. Mike and Morley are going to talk, hopefully not simultaneously, for about 20 minutes, talk about the thesis of the book, the argument, how they lay it out. And then Henry and Elaine, let me introduce everyone. I assume you have programs, and so that they will give you a full bio of all the people. Mike and Morley have extensive background in American public life. Morley as a major player in the Michigan Democratic Party before he moved to California and became a flower child. And Mike in writing and working in the TV industry and thinking about audiences. Elaine Kamarck to my right ran then Vice President Gore's reinventing government efforts. He was a major player in democratic thinking about how the electorate worked. The article, famous article she wrote with Bill Galston, laid out the problems the Democrats would face in the future in 1992, and she redid it again recently. To my left is Henry Olson, formerly the Manhattan Institute, where some of you may know him, and now a vice president at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. Henry has written brilliant articles on the changing shape of the electorate. And he's one of those people who's said to the Republicans, don't rejoice prematurely. There are hurdles you have to deal with. And probably the best thing I can say about Henry is that last year he picked the San Francisco Giants and not the Philadelphia Phillies to win it all, proving myself wrong and many others wrong. And those powers of foresight hopefully will be brought to our attention tonight. So I don't know who wants to speak.
Mike is going to start.
Could somebody please flip the slide for us? Well, I don't know there's a microphone there. So
oh, okay, good.
Okay. So we'll do it from here. I'll do it from here. Thank you. Turning it on helps. I don't have millennial skills, as you can see. The 2012 election is going to be, we believe, one of those landmark elections that occurs perhaps every 80 years throughout American history. And it is clear that both political parties recognize what is coming to them. We have a quotation from President Obama up that would indicate his sense of what is going to happen. And I can just read this really briefly because I don't know if you can read it or not. The 2012 election will be a slugfest between Republicans who don't believe in government as a partner with the private sector and Democrats who do. We're going to have 16 months in which we debate this vision for America. And Republicans, regardless of which of the candidates, many of them recognize that we are going to be seeing in 2012 and maybe in the years just beyond that, a debate over the vision for America. More specifically, we are going to be seeing a debate over the civic ethos of America. That is, what should be the scope and what should be the purpose of government. And as I indicated, about every 80 years, the country really tears itself apart and debates this issue in the most vigorous manner possible, trying to answer this question, again, what should be the scope and purpose of government. The first time it happened in our history was really pretty much at the beginning of the country, during the Revolutionary War and in the period from about 1773 to 1789. And the arguments over government were, first of all, at a very basic level, where is government going to be centered? Is it going to be centered here in the American colonies? Is it going to be centered across the ocean in London? But there were even other more debates than that. Who makes the policy? What is the relationship of the governed to the governed, to those who do the governed? What is the role? What are the rights of individuals in a situation like this? And those were the crucial issues that had to be decided in the Revolutionary War and in the years beyond that. So the Revolutionary War indicated and determined that indeed the American colonies would become a separate nation on their own. But even then, the issue was not fully resolved. There were the Articles of Confederation, which proved to be unsatisfactory. They didn't seem to be able to provide enough central governing power to provide for the commerce, to provide for the security of the new nation, and so we developed the Constitution under which we are currently governed. So that was the first era of these debates. The second was at the time of the Civil War, again, roughly 80 years later, and we debated again this very basic nature. What is the role of the state governments versus the federal government? How much influence do the states have over key issues compared to federal or national policy? And even at a more basic level, who can be a citizen of the United States? Who has rights in the United States? And there was a Supreme Court decision which argued, in an effort to try to resolve this issue, that African Americans, black people, could not be citizens. They could be enslaved in any part of the nation, and they could not be citizens of the United States with legal standing that would allow them to sue in the court. So there were these kinds of very basic debates. This was resolved, perhaps unfortunately, on a series of battlefields, and eventually enshrined the outcome in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which did say that, first of all, slavery was not going to be allowed any place in the country, and that people at least had the legal right to be citizens regardless of their color. But this debate didn't turn out quite so well because of a political indecision in the 1876 election, which was a deadlock between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Democratic candidate got the greatest number of popular votes. There were disputes in 4 states over who had actually won the electoral votes. And the bargain was made that the country would elect a Republican president and end Reconstruction. And so the full fruition of these amendments was delayed for another century. After 1929, from 1929 to 1941, the country suffered from its greatest economic disaster in history, and there was some question as to exactly what would be the role of government in dealing with the economy. What would the federal government do in this arena? And the decision was made that the federal government had an important function. It was given the role of guiding the economy, providing as much stability as might be possible to a large and dynamic economy, and also providing at least some sort of a floor beneath which Americans would not be allowed to fall economically. So these were the 3 debates we've had. We are now emerging into another one of these debates. Now, every one of these debates that has occurred, each time these debates begin with what we have described as a period of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or FUD, F-U-D, that would say that people are looking at this, they're looking at the old order, they see that the old order doesn't seem to be working particularly well, they don't know what the new order will be. And these periods of fear, uncertainty, and doubt divide the nation about as sharply as it can be divided. When we look back at the Revolutionary War period, we seem to kind of have a sense that we were all patriots, all Americans were patriots. But actually, about a third, roughly, as best we can estimate, a third of the American colonies were patriots, wanted to separate from England. A third were Tories, wanted to stick with the British Empire that they had always been a part of, and a third really didn't know. Obviously, we had a pretty even division at the period of the Civil War that had to be resolved by a gun, and in the 1930s, even though we look back and think that everybody loved FDR, everybody didn't love FDR, and many of the things that are said about President Obama today, things like socialist and foreign and things of that nature, were labels that were hurled at the president of that era, Franklin Roosevelt. What it more specifically involves is that a new generation arises at the time of a period of flood, at the time of these civic searches for a new civic ethos, and what this new generation wants to achieve, its goals, its beliefs, are resisted by those in power, as symbolized by the old lion fighting the younger lion. And in all of these disputes, compromise is very hard to achieve, but ultimately America emerges from these periods of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and emerges from these periods of of uncertainty and develops a new synthesis, a synthesis between two core American beliefs, between a belief in individual responsibility and a belief in collective action. And these are somewhat contradictory. In the frontier era, people would go out, they would try to start their own farmsteads, but they would also rely on their neighbors to help them build barns. And that has been writ large in American life. So people have a belief that we are responsible for ourselves as individuals. We believe in small government, but we also believe in collective action to resolve specific problems. And this is, the synthesis is reached in whatever the new version of American democracy is. Back in 1964, for the first time, several political scientists, Free and Cantrell, used Gallup poll data to demonstrate these two strands, empirically demonstrate these two strands in American life. They spoke about America's operational, or we would prefer the term programmatic beliefs, a belief in specific governmental programs, but also their ideological beliefs, their beliefs more specifically in individual liberty, individual responsibilities, limited government, and so on. And what they were able to determine using their Gallup poll questions, that about 2/3 of Americans at that era were programmatic liberals, believed in very specific governmental programs, but at the same time a majority of Americans, about half, and by about a 4-to-1 margin, believed that Americans were ideological conservatives. So on the abstract ideological level, Americans tend to be conservative. On the more specific governmental program level, Americans tend to be liberal and believe in governmental programs. Several years ago, Morley and I used Pew survey data in an attempt to recreate this dichotomy in American life. You won't see the exact kinds of translation of the Free and Cantrell data because we didn't have their questions. Pew didn't ask the same questions. But we were able to create, I think, a reasonable surrogate using the Pew data to look at American attitudes on some broad ideological questions and some more specific programmatic questions using data from 1987. When Pew started this survey, series of surveys, 1994, 2002, and 2009. So every 7 years we asked them to look at their data, to recalculate the data, to help us try to recreate those programs. And what the data suggests is that in every year, regardless of political events, regardless of what was going on, there were always more programmatic liberals than programmatic conservatives, more ideological conservatives than ideological liberals. So the pattern that Free and Cantrell had noticed in the mid-1960s, at the very end of the New Deal era, persisted in the decades beyond that. If you look at attitudes of people kind of in the middle of the political spectrum, people who are self-perceived moderates, you will find that these moderates tend to agree with liberals, self-perceived liberals on programmatic matters, and tend to agree with ideological conservatives on more ideological abstract matters. So for example, again, and as these folks in the middle, when you ask, Pew asked people, how do you feel about government regulation of business? And moderates, along with liberals, say, well, government regulation of business is a good thing. A majority say that it's necessary to benefit for the public good. More specifically, if you ask people, well, should Social Security and Medicare be changed in some way to resolve the deficit? Pretty much everybody rejects that. Even people who call themselves conservative, 2/3 of them say, no, this isn't a very good thing. So again, accepting specific governmental programs is something that pretty much every part of the political spectrum, but particularly those in the middle, are willing to adhere to. But on the other hand, those in the middle of the political spectrum, moderates, also tend to be ideological conservatives. So if you ask people, should we raise taxes to reduce the deficit? Liberals, those who call themselves liberals, a majority of them say, yeah, that's probably not a bad idea. That's the way we should deal with the deficit. But both moderates and self-perceived conservatives disagree with that. If you ask people, should we lower domestic spending to reduce the deficit, and don't really define domestic spending as to specifically what we're talking about, just use this global term, domestic spending, again, moderates tend to think that's a pretty good way of dealing with it, along with conservatives. Historically, the new civic ethos then has combined individual freedom and national commitments and alignments with a new civic generation's beliefs and behaviors. Millennials, the millennial generation that Morley will talk about in a moment in great detail, young Americans born 1982 to 2003, is just the most recent civic generation in American history. The GI generation, Tom Brokaw's greatest generation, was the last previous one. The founding fathers, they were so-called Republican generation back in the 18th century, not referring to the Republican Party, but to the American Republic, were another great civic generation. And every 80 years, the country realigns itself to and develops this new civic ethos to reflect the beliefs of this new civic generation. So just a little bit of word on the millennial generation briefly. I'll talk to you about their demographics and then turn it over to Morley who can talk to you about their attitudes. The millennial generation is the largest generation in American history. 95 million millennials are currently living in the United States today. 60% of them approximately now are adults and eligible to vote in the next election. It's the most diverse generation in American history. 4 in 10 millennials overall are non-white. The very youngest millennials, those who are still in grade school, middle school, close to half are non-white. And that is reflected in the attitudes of this generation. They tend to be more ethnically and racially tolerant, more aligned toward one another, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, than any other generation in American history. This particular data compares the attitudes of white Generation Xers, that's the generation just before millennials, the next oldest generation, with millennials. The question was asked, do you agree or disagree? I don't have much in common with people of other races. Only about a quarter of white Gen Xers agreed with that. On the other hand, almost a majority of white millennials agree, at least in part, and most of them disagree completely, that they have nothing in common with people of other races or ethnicities. Finally, this millennial generation is the most gender neutral of any generation in American history. And in fact, if anything, it is a generation that is probably more driven by the female members of the generation and the male members of the generation than any in American history. We just have a few basic figures that by 2016, it's estimated that women will earn 2/3 of associate's degrees in America, about 6 out of 10 bachelor's and master's degrees, and for the first time in our history, a majority of doctorates will be earned by women, as well as professional degrees of all types. So I've spoken to you a little bit about the demographics of this generation. I'll turn it over to Morley, who can talk to you about how this generation was reared and its beliefs.
So I don't have to look backwards. Can I have documentation? Otherwise, I'll spend all my time with my head turned to the audience. So we're not going to spend a lot of time. Mike's given you the demographics on how the attitudes that I'm about to share with you came about. But this slide is an attempt to capture all of it. The 7 specific traits of millennials are that they consider them special because they were told they were by their parents over and over. They've lived a relatively sheltered and protected young childhood. Certainly the events of 9/11 caused their parents to double down on the safety side of life, not allowing to go outside and have but requiring play dates that were supervised. And they're a very optimistic, confident generation. We'll show you some of those numbers as they exist today, because people often challenge that statement in the face of the economic hardships we've imposed upon this generation. But they do in fact remain optimistic, believe that they can accomplish great things, and if you ask them for proof, they can cite the 2008 election, as Fred talked about earlier. It's also very important to understand the team orientation of their upbringing, the importance of playing nice with the group, of treating everybody in the group equally, of looking for consensus solutions that work for all members of the group. In direct contrast to all you boomers in the audience, this is not a win-lose generation. This is a win-win generation. They were, however, pressured to accomplish things. They remained very concerned about failing. It's not something that millennials handle well at the individual level. They're much more comfortable in situations where the entire team is trying to achieve something. And they're also a conventional generation in the sense of believing in the need for social rules, which is the way their parents raised them. The household had rules. There wasn't any physical discipline to enforce those rules, but there certainly was a lot of negotiation about the consequences, from 3-minute timeouts to 5-minute timeouts. And of course, millennials bring that wonderful sense of negotiating skills into the workforce as well as into academia, where it's routinely hated. So that's just a little brief about the parental upbringing that caused this generation to have the attitudes that they do. Let's wrap up our remarks with some commentary on this set of attitudes and how it might play out in the next civic ethos that America is going to struggle to figure out the answer to, but ultimately adopt in the course of this decade. All of the controversies that Mike cited, the earlier periods in our history over debates of civic ethos, have always taken a decade to resolve. So even though we're in a period of FUD now, we haven't entered into the rest of that cycle that goes beyond fear, uncertainty, and doubt into real arguments that are ultimately resolved. But this is one that almost everybody knows. The lessons about tolerance and working with everybody leads millennials to have much more favorable attitudes towards gay marriage than older generations. 2-to-1 pro-gay marriage among millennials, and the majority of older generations opposed. Mike, I don't think mentioned, but I'll reinforce just in case he did, that 1 out of 5 millennials have an immigrant parent. Just like the GI generation that was the children of the immigrants that came to New York and elsewhere at the turn of the last century, this generation are the children of the immigrants who appeared on America's shores and its borders at the end of the last century and the beginning of this one. And therefore they have much more favorable attitudes towards issues of immigration than older folks. This particular Pew question, all of these are from March of this year, so they're post when we wrote the book, but we gave you the most current data we could. This asked in the blue side on the left side of it, I think the way you're looking at it, immigrants strengthen country because of hard work and talent, or they're a burden because they take jobs, housing, and health care. Well, 57% of millennials agree with the positive statement about immigrants, only 35% with the negative. By contrast, older generations tilt toward the negative side by a 46 to 41% margin. When asked the question about, this is a very traditional question that pollsters ask about, do you favor smaller government with fewer services over on the left, favor bigger government with more services over on the right, you can see a dramatic, in fact, complete opposite answer from the millennial generation to everybody else, reflecting even less ideological conservatism than other generations of Americans. By a 54 to 39% margin, millennials prefer a bigger government with more services, and those percentages are exactly the opposite of way older generations answered that question. In fact, when asked about government, millennials are more likely to say that government often does better jobs than people give it credit for. A majority of millennials say that, 52%. Only 42% believe that government almost always is wasteful or inefficient. They obviously never worked in reinventing government with Elaine and I. But, and yet, of course, older generations are dramatically different than that answer, with 59% favoring the almost always wasteful and inefficient answer as opposed to the more positive statement. And then just a few more of these for you so you get a sense of the civic ethos that's coming, regardless of sort of however current events might play out. This question goes back to the regulation issue that Mike used when citing data about the sort of schizophrenic nature of America's political thought, both conservative and liberal at the same time, not one person one way and one person other, but inside the same person. When asked government regulation of businesses necessary to protect the public interest, a majority of millennials, 51%, agree, only 43% disagree. Older generations are evenly split on that question. And then in the current debate about deficit reduction, which Pew was interested in asking at the time of these questions because the debate was very hot, you can see that the blue bars of millennials are smaller on the top priority or even on the important but lower priority potential answers, compared to 56% of older generations who, at least at the time, thought it ought to be a top priority. And therefore, you shouldn't be surprised that millennials are the only generation where more people call themselves liberals than call themselves conservatives. Now, obviously, the largest number of them identify as moderates for all the reasons that Mike talked about. But that's a dramatic difference from the red bar generations behind those blue bars, with 41% of older generations saying they're conservative and only 20% saying they're liberal. The older generations are 2 to 1 if you ignore the moderates in the middle on the right-left spectrum on the right side, whereas millennials take an opposite or at least equal point of view on those questions. And therefore, it also should not surprise you that when you ask people whether they're Democratic or Republican and follow it up for all those who answer independent as to whether they lean to one party or another, Democrats and those who lean Democratic make up 52% of the millennial generation. Only 39% identify themselves as Republicans or independents who lean Republican. And that, of course, is also different than the older generations, although a slight plurality also identify themselves as Democrats among older generations. It's a much smaller margin of 47 to 44. For those of you forced to listen to CNN News, you may notice that only 9% of the electorate is independent, truly independent. And therefore, they are inconsequential in the outcome of the 2012 election. You heard that here first. And in fact, those people who are truly independent and don't lean either way are also the least informed and least likely to vote. So not only are they not numerically important, they're not going to be important in the electorate either. Okay, one last thing about all that group thought and team orientation that we talked about before on millennials. Did that actually move? No. Okay. This group orientation is not limited to the way they work with others and how they make decisions, but also how they think about the world and the challenges that the world presents. So here is some more data on millennials, and we'll wrap up here to satisfy Fred at least and let other people talk. If you ask people, is America an exceptional country, or is it and stands above all else, or is it one of the greatest countries, but there are others who are in that category, and then ask whether some countries are better than the United States, that's the very small bars over on the right. You can see that millennials are much more likely to say that the U.S. is one of the world's greatest countries, along with some others, in comparison to those who have, among older generations, a much stronger belief that America is an exceptional country. And then it gets more specific in terms of how you want to deal in matters of foreign policy. This is a multilateralist generation. 2/3 of them think that the U.S. should take account of the interests of our allies, even if it involves compromise. So the question was put so it wouldn't be quite so easy to answer. Whereas older generations, by only a 49 to 38% margin, would adopt that multilateralist approach. But here's this notion of teaming and getting along and working things out that evolves and migrates into the foreign policy arena. And then when you ask about our big economic rival, the question is, do you favor building stronger economic relationships with China or get tougher with them on economic issues? By an overwhelming 70 to 23, 4 to 1 margin, millennials are in favor of the cooperative approach, whereas most older generations evenly divide on the question. Final two for your data folks out there. Free trade. This is an item that's in the news these days. So by a 65 to 27% margin, millennials favor free trade agreements, believe they're good things for the United States, versus them thinking that they were a bad thing. Whereas a plurality of older generations think free trade agreements are a bad idea by a 45 to 42% margin. So for those who believe that, we're kind of moving towards an isolationist trade and foreign policy perspective, this generation has new news for all of you. And then finally, why? Because like other civic generations, this generation is inherently more optimistic about the future, and in fact more satisfied with the conditions in America, even though they're suffering the highest levels of unemployment of any generation, burdened with student debt that this democracy has never imposed upon a generation. It's never required a generation to self-finance the education necessary for the country's future economic success. Nevertheless, 41% of millennials are optimistic and, satisfied with current conditions in America. Only 16% of older generations, who are of course the ones lecturing you on the news about how bad things are, believe that things are good. So how's this all going to work out? Well, the book suggests in a number of areas, almost every institution in America that you can think of, education, government, entertainment, lifestyles, family, suburban living patterns, and foreign policy or whatever, we talk about how this civic ethos idea of millennials is going to work itself out. Because even though the country is inherently conservative and liberal at the same time, an enduring civic ethos, pardon me, is built by combining both into a new political synthesis. Whether that was done by saying we're going to pass the Constitution of the United States, we need you to ratify it, but we're going to promise you individual liberty in the form of a Bill of Rights, or whatever consensus gets worked out, it's almost always a consensus built upon the civic era and millennial generations like our millennials. We believe this particular one will be uniquely millennial in its approach, completely different, by the way, than the progressive movement that gave us the New Deal civic ethos of the last century. It will be both pragmatic and idealistic at the same time, because that's what the generation is. It will focus greatly upon local and individual initiative in order to accomplish national goals, even though to older folks that seems like an oxymoron. And so you're going to have a collaborative and individual empowerment approach that combines both strands of the U.S. political DNA in a new way. I brought along only one example that I want to conclude with. In honor of two folks in the audience, Hillary Doe and Zach Coliden, who are millennials building this new civic ethos every day, here's one of their 10 policy documents created by, in a truly millennial way, the conversation of thousands of members of the millennial generation thinking about what kind of world they wanted to have and be in charge of in 2040. And in doing that, they envisioned this America in the future. To give you an example, and I'll only touch upon it so that everybody else can talk, about how local initiative is thought about as the way to solve national problems. There's one policy recommendation, and this is about the social safety net. So this is FDR's social safety net in many ways, the New Deal's social safety net re-envisioned by millennials. Participatory budgeting so that we can democratize local economies. I'm sorry, I want to grab the one that I was looking for. And just as another one, the Social Security bridge, which is the reason I reached for it, insurance for the involuntarily retired. So not an abandonment of the social safety net, but ways of turning it into a safety trampoline and allowing people to get back into the successful mode of their lives. Hopefully that gives you some sense of the future of America and its civic ethos. We look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for inviting us here, and I love Morley's and Mike's first book and have assigned it to my classes, and will do so with the second book as well.
We strongly recommend that to all professors in the audience.
I should say that one of the fascinating things that happens in the classroom with this book, my students at the Kennedy School, the younger ones tend to be millennials. They tend to be 25, 26, 27. But then we have a lot of Gen Xers because we have mid-career students and we have students so into their 30s and 40s. These two groups really don't like each other. They really have very different points of view. And when you see them discussing these things in the classroom, it really is pretty funny. They break just as Morley and Mike anticipated them to break in a variety of ways. So let me talk to you a little bit about that, about some of the differences I've seen between them in the classroom and in some of the data that I've done, and throw it open then to Henry and to discussion. First of all, there is a question about these millennials and their capacity to be entrepreneurs and to innovate. And this is something that it kind of falls out of your chapter on how about the team building ethos, etc. You know, part of the greatness of the American economy is that we are really an innovative economy. We make up things like iPads that the rest of the world wants to buy. And in fact, a colleague of mine has done a terrific piece of economic work, and it basically shows one very simple and striking correlation. If a country manufactures things, a whole variety of things that the rest of the world wants to buy, they are wealthy. And for all of our troubles, the United States and Germany sit way up in that quadrant, and nobody else is even close to us. So diversity, innovation in an economy has always been our strength. And I must say that everything you sort of see about the millennials, for all the good things about them, there is a sort of, I do put that question, and I want to hear what Mike and Morley say about it. I put that question as to whether or not they have the entrepreneurial ethos. Second point I would make is that while political change most certainly happens from demographics, it really does happen quite slowly. And so if you look at, for instance, the emergence of Hispanics into the U.S. electorate, my colleagues in the Democratic Party have been saying for 20 years that, oh, Hispanics, they're going to be the savior of the Democratic Party. Well, you know, only last year only in 2008 did the Hispanic portion of the presidential vote reach 9%. 9%. And for the previous years, when this was a great big issue, it was 6%, it was 7%, it was 8% for the 2 years before that. So while this change happens, it actually happens very gradually and very slowly. And while we talk about the country eventually being, you know, more mixed race than white, etc., that happens gradually. It doesn't happen tomorrow. Third point is, what that means is that if Barack Obama and the Democrats can't win white voters next time, they're still going to lose. Doesn't matter what the millennials do, okay? They're still going to lose. And there is a sort of assumption out there that young people plus minorities equal this great big, you know, liberal democratic base. Well, a lot of the minorities are young people. So it's not two separate groups that are additive. It's really one group. So I think that in sort of just looking at the political impact of this, it is there. It's certainly there for the long run. But it's not likely to save a given president in any particular cycle, okay? That still is a very difficult issue where you have to win a lot of groups, not just one group. Finally, I want to question what is the long-term impact of the world that they're coming into on the millennials. Clearly, in realignment theory, you come in with a president who is a transformative president. He makes a huge, they've always been he's, that's why I say this, he makes a huge impact. And so, you know, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law were Roosevelt Democrats to the day they died, because that was their president. Roosevelt, however, was also a successful president in his own time and viewed in history. Similarly, these Gen Xers they saw Reagan, okay? And Reagan was a successful president in his own time on his own terms. Does being successful, do you have to be successful to imprint a generation? Will this generation stay Democrats? And my final point is that to the extent that they do, they will change also the Democratic Party. And the internal party problems will be fairly robust. So Morley's last slide was one I was hoping, actually, if he hadn't put it up there, I was going to mention it. You've got a political party where a significant portion of its base consists of the organized labor movement. The organized labor movement has been against just about every trade agreement that there's been in the last 20 to 30 years. And you have a generation that is very much in favor of free trade, and you can see why. They're more internationalist. They've actually traveled around the world a lot. They see a global economy in ways. Well, that's a Democratic Party fight. Okay, that's a fight for what the party stands for and what it does. And so, to the extent that these young people remain on the Democratic side of the aisle, they are going to force some pretty big fights, changes, rethinking within the Democratic coalition itself. So with that, I'll hand it over to my friend Kevin.
Thank you, Elaine. I actually agree with most of everything that you said. But that's actually not the sort of what my comments were. So nothing you said actually preempted anything I was planning to say. As the sole Republican on the panel, what I'd like to do is try and offer a perspective.
We think.
Well, Fred's never been clear.
My point.
Fred is a mystery.
The last time I talked to Fred, he was a Democrat who had Republican inclinations. But not from an orthodox perspective, because as Fred knows from my writing, in fact, I'm a conservative Republican, but not one who particularly wants to follow unthinkingly a poorly orthodoxy. In fact, my writing at Hill today was another article on exactly that, which is warning, warning, danger ahead for conservatives. The three questions, particularly with respect to the 2012 election, that are posed by Morley and Michael that I want to take a look at are: one, what are the short-term impacts of millennials, qua millennials, on the 2012 election? And I want to do that in part to get to the question that, or the point that Elaine raised, which is that there is a lot of overlap between what's called the rising American electorate in Democratic political consultant speak, between millennials and ethnic minorities. And we have to disentangle those two if we want to take a look at the electoral effect of millennials, qua millennials, as opposed to the different composition effects of the different quantities of whites and non-whites in that group. Second, what's the long-term impact of millennials, qua millennials, on American politics? Is there going to be one, certainly? And if so, what might it be? What I'm going to argue and try and show is that a lot of what you look at with respect to millennials is in fact driven by the composition effect, that it is a much larger share of non-whites than whites, and that the actual effect of millennials, qua millennials, on the election is relatively small. Not inconsiderable, could be decisive in a very close race, but is in fact quite small. Secondly, I'd like to argue that the long-term potentials of millennials, qua millennials, on American politics is potentially real, but as Elaine said in her remarks, uncertain, because people do change. People change both on the nature of what succeeds and does not succeed, as she mentioned, but also based on life experiences. I'd like to bring some data out on that. And then the third thing I'd like to say is a little provocative, which is to say, let's take everything at face value that Morley and Michael say with one caveat, and that is that let's assume that conservatives are not willing to remain simply static. Do they have a chance with this generation? And I'd like to say that assuming that millennial effect is real, assuming it's long-term and pervasive in terms of its attitudes, is it necessarily long-term in terms of its partisan effect? And I would say that would depend on what conservatives and Republicans do. The question, assuming the attitudes remain the same, are, is this generation going to empower progressive politics and in fact remake it? Or is it going to humanize libertarianism? And what I'd like to do is suggest a course of how the same inclinations that Morley and Michael talk about are in fact consistent with the humanized version of libertarianism, and one that's not inconsistent with that sort of stream which a lot of us in the Gen X world are actually trying to promote within the conservative Republican Party. So let's take a look at the composition effect. And what I mean by that is that you have to make sure you're measuring what you say you're measuring. Let's say somebody says, I'm going to tell you what the difference in attitudes between farmers in Washington and Idaho are with respect to apples and oranges. And you say that farmers in Idaho like apples over oranges 60 to 40, but farmers in Washington like apples over oranges 80 to 20. You'd assume that there's some sort of difference between farmers in Washington and farmers in Idaho. But if I told you that among the sample, 20% of the Idaho farmers grew apples and 45% of the Washington farmers grew apples, you might think that in fact you're not measuring a real difference that is their difference of their status of farmers, but rather their difference of apple growers. And that's in part what we find when we look behind the scenes at the Gallup exit poll that's attracted so much attention, or the national exit poll, it's not a Gallup poll. If you look at the national numbers, the millennial generation, 18 to 24-year-olds, because the 25 to 29-year-olds are born before the definition of millennial that you were talking about, were 66 to 32 for Obama. Shocking numbers. They were 56 to 43 for Kerry in 2004. Whites, however, white millennials were 52 to 47 for Obama. You report that number, that's a more Democratic than most any other white generation, but not hugely so. That's a split that you'd say, well, it's a bad economy, unpopular guy, 67-year-old war vet. Lots of reasons why a young white person might vote for Barack Obama but still be open to persuasion by the Republican Party. Hispanic millennials broke for Obama 78 to 16. That's overwhelmingly the largest break for Obama among Hispanic age groups. Black millennials voted for Obama 98 to 2, the most Democratic, even among an incredibly Democratic constituency, celebrating the election of one of their own to the White House, in which they voted Democratic by a record margin, even among African Americans. If you take a look and you break down the exit poll, you find that only 56% of the people in the exit poll were white among the millennial generation. Now, it is true that about 40% of the millennial generation is non-white. If you look at the people who are eligible to vote right now, that will drop by a couple of percent because, as you noted, that the people who are youngest in the generation are the largest non-white contingent. And if you control for citizenship, which is to say that there are Asians and Latinos who are in the 18 to 24, now 18 to 29 generation who are not eligible to vote because they're not citizens, it actually drops to the eligible citizen pool to be more in the 35 to 37%. So whites were dramatically underrepresented among the millennial generation in the 2008 election. What made up the difference? 17% of the millennials who voted were Hispanic, compared to 9% in the entire electorate. 20% of the millennials were African American, which is roughly double their share of the electorate as a whole, and more than 60% larger than their share of the millennial generation. Clearly, the president inspired people of color who were of millennial generation to come out to vote for him. And clearly he had some appeal, and a strong appeal among white millennial generation. But a lot of what you see is a composition effect, not a millennial qua millennial effect. Now let's take that out and take a look again and compare it among the races, the millennial generation to other generations. You do find that they tend to be significantly more Democratic in the 5 to 7 point range than other generations. So let's assume that all of that is a millennial effect. Now, it's nothing to do with the circumstances of the 2008 race or the personalities, but it's all due to the differences in attitudes that Morley and Michael talk about. I'll spare you the math, but basically what that means is that millennials will add about 2% to Barack Obama's vote total, or about 1 to 2% to his vote total, and 3 to 4% on the margin. That's important in a close race, but it's not decisive. It's not transformational. It's something that is worth looking at, but it's not something that's going to change the world. Put another way, if blacks return, or African Americans return to their historic voting patterns from 95 to 5 for Obama to merely 90 to 10, that would eliminate half of the millennial effect. if Jewish voters return from going 80 to 20 for Barack Obama, which is roughly what they did in 2008, to a more historic pattern of 75 to 25, or even the sort of patterns that you saw that were indicated by the result in New York 9, that maybe it would be 2/3, 1/3, which is what it was in the 80s and early 90s. That would eliminate about 60% of the millennial effect. Again, it's real, it's important in the short term, it's not decisive or transformational. There's indications that among white young voters, the attitudes toward the president are already changing. I'm looking at an August poll from Stanley Greenberg, who is known as a progressive Democratic pollster, who finds that among white youth, which is 18 to 29-year-old, a Republican is favored over President Obama among the presidency by 50 to 45. It's roughly a 7% drop from where they were in 2008, which is about on par with the movement among whites in the electorate as a whole since 2008, and roughly identical to what you saw between 2008 and 2010 among whites. Again, they're still more liberal than other whites, but it's not a decisive factor. The things that they talked about as far as attitudes are real. I've read the Millennial poll by Pew, I've read other polls, and they do show striking degrees of openness and tolerance. I would love to see those numbers race normed, to see how much of them are due to the composition effect and how white millennials compare to white older generations, black millennials compared to black older generations, and so forth. But one reason I give them particular credence, particularly on social issues, is it's part of a multi-decadal pattern that Pew's documented, which is to say that each generation is a few percentage points more liberal on what we would call social issues than the one that's preceding it. This has been something that's been going on for 50 years, and the millennials are not, except on questions like gay marriage, where there is a sharp break. On the broad pattern of social issues, they tend to follow that trend of creeping social liberalism or non-traditionalism. This is going to matter. It's going to matter a lot. The things that Morley and Michael talk about with respect to their communitarianism, which I would label as a soft communitarianism, is also real. I mean, I work exclusively with millennials, and they're Republican millennials, and they have all of the same attitudes, all of the same habits. They're going to change the world. They're going to work in a way that's not totally driven by profit, work-life balance. There is a millennial effect. But the thing that strikes me about looking at these millennials is that they reject status, and they reject enforced authority to a very large degree. The sorts of communities they choose are communities of choice. They're communities of people who share like-minded interests. They can enter and leave according to their own convenience. And that is a completely different type of way to look at government. If you take that as their norm, and this is part of what Elaine's third point was, which is that if you take the millennial vision and apply it to the actual conduct of the welfare state, it comes into direct contradiction with virtually every competing, with the way every welfare state is run in the developed world. And it runs into every particular special interest within the Democratic Party, from teachers' unions in education to labor unions in free trade. That is not going to be accomplished very easily. So why could this be something that a smart Republican Party can adapt to rather than leave happen to be a debate within the Democratic Party? What Morley and Michael talk about with respect to general operational liberalism is correct. You take a look even at polls of Tea Party people, and Tea Party people dislike government and they like Social Security. And you can look at that and say that it's hypocrisy, or you can look at it and say that it's cognitive dissonance, but there's a broad understanding, even among people who profess conservative ideals, that American life in 2011 is different than American life in 1911, and that there is and ought to remain a social commitment to help people who are needy. Paul Ryan is excoriated among many progressive bloggers as being a right-wing demon, but he gave an important policy address at the Hoover Institute last week calling for universal health care coverage through tax credits and private insurance funded in part by the taxpayer. It's difficult to imagine Ronald Reagan calling for universal health insurance coverage. A humanized libertarianism would say that we have community obligations to people, but that what we need to do is let them create their own communities of choice within that obligation, which is to say a state that looks at its obligation as one of providing resources rather than providing services, one that provides money instead of providing material and men, is one that is equally as consistent with the millennial outlook as one that would be a reinforcement of the progressive state, and one that actually would probably require less internal battle because it would be something that would have its own political force that doesn't have to confront those that doesn't have to confront the interests directly. Will Republican establishment see this in time before these voters' senses of partisan inclinations are relatively frozen? That is the battle that's going on within the Republican Party right now. That is the battle that will continue to go on within the Republican Party regardless of what happens in 2012. And it's the the alternative to this possibility that I'd like to leave you to think of, that even if you think that the demographics are set in destiny, that doesn't mean that the outcome is written in stone.
Thank you, Henry.
My only comment about blacks returning to historical levels of voting present since 1995, my only comment would be, well, that'll happen if Obama turns white. But I don't think that's going to be true in 2012. So
I only mention that as a
yeah, I understand. As I said, I'll let Mike deal with the data issues. But I do think it's very important what Henry said and what Elaine said, because our argument is not that millennials are progressive New Deal Democrats. Our argument, in fact, is that they represent something completely different. There's nothing in the millennial upbringing that would suggest that they are, as Henry pointed out, in love with the welfare state and the lack of choice in government services any more than they are in the private marketplace. And therefore the challenge for America is to find a new way of synthesizing those two strands of American political DNA that Mike talked about. And our bet is that it will be done in a millennial way. Millennials reject expertise. They reject direction from the center or from the top. They're in favor of bottom-up community and civic and collective decision-making. And Henry has sketched out a possible way for a more, as he called it, humanized libertarianism to take that into account and potentially attract millennial voters. And Elaine has suggested that that opportunity is presented the less successful you believe the president's administration has been or will be. I think that's all true. Our point is that there's another civic ethos out there which is not the straw man that Henry put up, which is a reformed progressivism. Our book described instead of a completely different thing, not a hybrid, not a reformation, but a completely different thing, which we, for lack of a better term, call the millennialist public policy approach. And we suggest that that's the more likely winner about this debate. But it's very clear that the debate is on, the winner is unknown, it will take the country a decade to figure it out. The 2012 election will be important in determining pretty much which direction the country ends up at least exploring and attempting to see if it's the right one. But there is clearly the two choices, and I think Henry's done a terrific job of describing exactly how that alternative might be shaped. And just as Elaine pointed out the difficulties that the millennial attitudes will bring to the Democratic Party, I think Henry was accurate in suggesting how that kind of approach will face enormous difficulties within the structure and establishment of the Republican Party. But as Mike's Young Lion slide indicated, that is the fight, and that is the fight that we're going to have. sorry.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on data, but I will make a few comments about it. Henry did seem to suggest that somehow and I think those were the 2008 exit poll
Right.
numbers that you were citing,
Right.
that somehow we're over-representing minorities within the millennial community. When in point of fact, we are not we are looking at the generation as a whole, and the generation as a whole, and actually we would have defined it as 18 to 26 at that point, not 18 to 24. It's a small quibble, but nevertheless, it was slightly older than that, is about a 60% white, 40% minority generation. And so the numbers that you cited are really not all that different than is the reality of that generation. It was reasonably representative in the exit poll setting. And as each successive group of millennials comes into the electorate, the millennial generation component of the electorate is in fact going to become more and more non-white. The youngest millennials are more non-white than the oldest millennials. So those numbers are in fact accurate. More of concern is that at least in the most recent surveys I've seen, the CNN survey about a week and a half ago, which looked at presidential pairings, suggested that the 2-to-1 margin for Barack Obama over every one of the major Republican candidates, Perry, Romney, Paul, Bachmann, is still maintained at that 2-to-1 margin that the president enjoyed over John McCain. So that
Among millennials.
Among millennials, of course not among the electorate, but among millennials. So those numbers have held up. What is particularly important about the generation is that, as was pointed out, millennials contributed about 17% of the electorate in 2008. They at least have the potential to contribute about 24% now in 2012. If that turnout is perhaps more of a key for the millennial vote, then I think the direction of that vote at this point. But if the turnout reaches or comes close to that 24%, is large enough to bring it close to that 24%, then the millennial generation will provide some cushion for the president against other votes that aren't going in his direction. But it really is a matter of balancing what millennials do with what other generations do. Millennials provided, in fact, 80% of the president's margin in 2008. They turned what would have been a very narrow 1 or 2 percentage point win into the 7-point victory that he did have. And so far, at least, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of evidence that the generation has deserted the president when it becomes a choice of him against the likely opponents that he will face. And I just want to respond to a couple of things Elaine said. You're right, it may be a very different Democratic Party. Every time we have these transformations, political parties change. The Democratic Party of 1936 was very different than the Democratic Party of 1928, as personified by the fact that the Democratic chairman in 1928, John Jacob Raskob, and the Democratic candidate in 1928 both endorsed Franklin Roosevelt's opponent, Alf Landon, rather than Franklin Roosevelt. So essentially left the party. It was a new Democratic Party. Will Barack Obama be a transformative president? That remains, I think, the operative question. I agree with you. In our book, we talk about the 4 Ps of presidential politics, which would be policy, performance, public relations, and politics. And really all 4 of those have to work in intermeshed fashion with one another. It does seem that the President Obama, is paying more attention, or had paid more attention in the first part of his administration to the policy and to the performance aspects, and a lot less to the politics and public relations aspects. He seems to have shifted modes at this point. But there really is that question as to whether he will be the transformative president that FDR was, that Abraham Lincoln was before him.
I want to open up, rather than keeping on these themes, I want to open up another issue that is quite provocative in the book, and I think quite accurate, and this is the issue of technology. And as Morley and Mike point out, a lot of these transformative presidents and these realigning eras coincide with the entrance of a new technology on the scene. For Roosevelt, it was radio. For Barack Obama, obviously, it's the internet. What strikes me, though, is in spite of all of the rhetoric from the Obama administration, how really underwhelming the internet, the new technology, has been in helping them solve any problems. It just doesn't work in the era of government. Now, I will say that, okay, it's possible that in 10 or 20 years we're going to see a way in which this does work. But right now, it feels a little bit like we've been sold a bill of goods, that by being completely open and transparent and having this wonderful communitarian ethos and everybody sending in their answers and this grassroots, well, come on, it didn't do much. It didn't get you a very coherent health care bill. That bill almost lost and may be unconstitutional. It hasn't solved the housing problem. It hasn't solved the jobs problem. It didn't really come up with an Afghanistan solution. So, I mean, I think there are the seeds here of a real kind of letdown for some of this generation and for some of us who kind of hoped that this generation was going to really do it. And part of that stems from what I see as a disappointment in the capacity of the technology to do anything more than mobilize for a vote, which is a fairly straightforward thing, and not to actually help transform the governing process.
Again, I'd like to agree with you. One of the things that strikes me, again, is watching kids use this stuff, is it breaks down barriers to conversation. That what really attracts them to social media is the ability to talk with who you want to about what you want to, when you want to, in real time, even though you can't see each other. It's hard to imagine a public official being able to be candid enough to have that sort of freewheeling conversation. And when you look at the way public officials, I think it was something in your book, Republicans were some early adopters, but now all these politicians are using social media, but they're using it in a way that safeguards themselves.
Right.
But you have to ask...
Which may not be the point, right?
Which may not be the point, but then flip it over, which is, say, if you're meeting your demand, you're a congressman in a district of 750,000 people. The advantage of Facebook is you can enter into communications with whom you want to, about what you want to, and they're relatively unstructured. Do you want to do that? Do you have the time to do that? So, to the extent that the opportunity of social media has to actually influence politics, I think it'll be the sort of thing that will continue what we've been seeing since the demise of the machine in the late 1950s through the early 1970s, which is that technology destroys the ability of elites to control messages. That people can use these tools to organize around office holders, and that will affect American politics once people get adept to it, they get used to it. I don't think it's going to be something that's going to be able to be used very effectively by people who have status and authority to do more than what you saw in 2008, precisely because their position and status can't let them engage the features of this new technology that makes it so powerful.
Mike probably wants to answer this question, but of course you have failed to consider the other possibility, which is the white vote becomes more Hispanic in its nature. The marriage is a two-way thing, especially among millennials, where we have a generation that believes, based upon their parents' behavior, that males and females do not distinguish themselves by role, even in such fundamental things as childcare. And so don't assume that the potential effect is one way or the other. In fact, it's much more of a blurring and more of a consensus, the same way that the experiences of World War II, of the various ethnicities that existed in America and lived, in many cases, separate neighborhood lives, ended once the Biloxi Blues Barracks experience occurred for them. So that would be my answer. Mike might have some data answer, but sure, go ahead.
Could I just add to that, though? I think I'm more sympathetic to your point. I have seen studies done of suburban Hispanics. Suburban Hispanics on a whole host of policy issues, including immigration, don't look very different from any other suburbanite.
But of course, a majority of millennials want to live in the suburbs, and a majority of America's racial and ethnic minorities do live in the suburbs. So that may not be the right way to look at the electorate.
But my point is that there seems to be some effect, and I think the Italian example is a good one, of the sort of, unlike African Americans, who had a much harder time, and African Americans did not have the melting pot experience, because, I mean, there were even laws that African Americans couldn't marry white people. So African Americans were the one group excluded from the melting pot experience. And I think that a lot of times when we try to project forward, we put Hispanics in the African American experience when in fact they may be closer to the Italian experience in terms of sort of one generation, you intermarry, you're in the suburbs, and before you know it, yeah, you cook, you know, like we do, you cook pasta on Sunday, but other than that, you're really not different than anybody else.
But Elaine, I think you said, at the end, you said the magic word, and that's generation.
So you got to talk into the mic.
You said the magic word, and that's generation. And voting behavior research would certainly suggest that once as individuals, their attitudes are formed, and their political beliefs and their political identifications are formed roughly from when they are 18 to 25 or 27 years old, that they maintain those identifications pretty much all of their lives. That doesn't mean, however, that their children who live under different circumstances and who are reared in a different way will not have different attitudes. So I would argue, I would still say that these millennials, regardless of their ethnicity, are likely to maintain their political beliefs once they are set in stone, but their children aren't necessarily going to be following those same beliefs 20, 30, 40, or 60 years from now.
Yeah, I'd like to just throw some data out that my colleague at AEI, Carlin Bowman, put together for an op-ed from the Wall Street Journal. And I understand that that's what a lot of social science research has shown, but what she finds is that when you take a look at what has actually happened to the baby boom generation, is you can document ideological and partisan change. She cites the University of Michigan's American National Election
Henry,
Study.
Who are you citing here?
It's a Wall Street Journal op-ed from July 28, 2011, by my AEI colleague, Carlin Bowman. In 72, that study showed that 51% of voters born between 1943 and 1958 called themselves Democrats, 29% as Republicans. In 2008, the answers were 45% Democrat and 48% Republican. On ideological questions, you had the same difference. 30% of those people called themselves liberals in 1972. In 2008, 12% did. The proportion calling themselves conservative rose to 46% in 2008 from 21% in 1972. Now, what this doesn't do is get at questions of underlying issues of attitude. Did the definitions of conservative and liberal change over time? Did how they perceived what a Republican and Democrat were perceived changed over time? But clearly, that people who in 1972 was an overwhelmingly liberal generation and an overwhelmingly Democratic generation is now a generation up for grabs.
No, I think that's the wrong assumption. They weren't overwhelmingly liberal. Go ahead.
Just let me get more questions.
But I just want to, we cannot leave that point. It is absolutely factually wrong to suggest that the boomers were an overwhelmingly liberal generation. That's the media portrayal of the generation. There were just as many people on one side of the cultural divide as there were on the other. That is still true in 2008. The baby boomer generation was exactly half and half. It has been that way throughout the generation's life when it comes to partisan decision making. And I know the op-ed you're citing, I know the data, but it has nothing to do with voting behavior, which that op-ed doesn't even talk about.
2 weeks ago, we were actually drawn from the book, but we wrote an article which appeared in the Christian Science Monitor about religion and the millennial generation's change in religion. And you are correct, America is the most I won't say religious country in the industrial world, or it may be the most religious country, but it's certainly the country most likely to profess a belief in God. 2/3, 80% of Americans say they believe in God. Millennials don't disagree with that. They are only slightly less likely, but a large majority profess to believe in God. But there are a couple of differences. One, millennials, while they may be spiritual, while they may say they believe in God, they are not doctrinal. They, as a generation, they are less likely to adhere to the traditional doctrinal religious beliefs of various religions. They are also, if they are diverse ethnically, they are diverse in religion as well. The American religious mainstream is going to broaden in this generation. About 1 out of 5 to 1 out of 4 millennials are unaffiliated with any religious church or any religious organization. This isn't simply because they're young. They are less likely to be affiliated than boomers were when boomers were the same age as millennials, less likely than Gen Xers when they are the same age as, were the same age as millennials are now. And what we recommended in that article is if religions are going to be able to cope with this change, that they would not emphasize so much their doctrinal beliefs or doctrinal differences as their service orientation. But this generation is driven in a different way. It focuses on religion in a far different way than other generations.
Millennials, first of all, politically are likely to vote for the community organizer who will be on the ballot in 2012, just as they did in 2008. And secondly, what we're trying to get across, obviously not quite as clearly as hopefully the book does, is that focus on community is separate and apart from political discussion and debate. Twice as many college freshmen in 2008, when they were millennials, said that community was more important than your job, as did Xers in 20 years before. The single biggest shift in values among young people was community versus job. If you translate that into politics, it's action at the local community level that will drive change in America, just as it's driving change across the world. It will be bottomed up and it will be disruptive, but it won't have anything to do with compromise. It will have to do with creating something brand new that emphasizes community. We've already had a lost decade. You're talking about the second lost decade.
No, it's not,
I mean,
no.
oh yes, middle-class incomes have not risen for the last 12 years.
Morley,
So we can't talk about a new lost
We're
decade.
going into a different dimension now. If from 2007 on we have a very weak economy, much weaker than before, and we have
No, we had a bad economy before 2007. We have a bad economy now.
Not compared-
It's just that people in New York didn't realize it.
Morley, and Elaine, you want to pick up on this?
Yeah. Well, it's entirely possible that this will happen, and I think that just as what you've seen in Japan during their lost decade or decades is a lot of party instability. Okay, they've had a lot of changes in government, because what happens when you're in a situation like this is you throw out the current bums, and then you elect a new bum, and if things don't get better in 4 years, it's that bum President Romney or that bum President Perry or whoever, and you go back and forth. And that's what we've seen in other democracies that have gone through periods of very low growth, which is the electorate actually bounces around quite a lot. I would argue that the dramatic transformation in the fortunes of the two political parties, where between 2006 and 2008, it really looked like a Democratic wave was happening. And then, boy, 2010 was pretty awful for the Democrats. And if these numbers you're saying, that who knows if they're that bad, if we have a double dip, 2012 could be a disaster for the Democrats. But if in fact there are underlying problems in the economy that cannot be straightened out, that simply take a decade to straighten out, no matter who's president, then what you will see the electorate do, because we've seen it in other democracies, is they'll just keep punishing who's ever in until you get some kind of new formulation. Now, I think that the most interesting thing that Morley and Mike are saying about these millennials is that they won't be either the old Republican Party or the old Democratic Party.
Correct.
That at some point, this new set of values will in fact result in some different kind of political arrangements. If those coincide with the end of this trough and you know, the beginning of some more prosperity in the United States, well then, whichever party manages to capture them is going to be the party for quite some time, just as happened with Roosevelt. So I think that if nobody solves it, you're going to see a lot of volatility in the electorate, just as we see a lot of volatility in the stock market. I mean, that's what happens when an economy is working off, and I go back to Fred's comment about a financial crisis, when an economy is working itself out of a financial disaster like the one we had, it takes a really long time, and there's a lot of volatility. That volatility is political as well as financial.